The snow didn't care who you were. It just fell, silent and thick, burying the world in a blanket of white so pure it made your own breath feel like a sin. Behind me, a trail of footprints in the powder was the only proof I'd ever existed at all. The wind, sharp as a needle, tore right through my thin summer dress. The hem was ripped, and my boots were gone. I'd left them on the porch, right where my sister-in-law Lydia had thrown them. "You got no right to stay," she'd said. Her chin was high, her arms crossed tight over a belly that held another man's child, not my brother's. That was a secret I'd kept for her, a secret that bought me nothing. "You've had years to find a man. It's not my job to feed you too." I hadn't said a word. What was there to say? My brother Caleb didn't even look at me. He just stood there, rubbing the bridge of his nose like I was a bad headache he couldn't wait to be rid of. That's what stung the most. Not the snow starting to crust in my hair, not the fire of hunger in my gut. It was the way his hand came to rest on Lydia's shoulder, a silent promise to her, and a final judgment on me. I had tried. Lord, I had tried not to be a burden. I sewed their clothes, swept their floors, and kept my voice low. I sang his two little girls to sleep every night until my throat was raw. But in the end, it didn't matter. I was just a scrap of cloth, used up and tossed aside. The road was a long, white ribbon now, winding past old, splintered fences and trees that looked like skeletal fingers pointing at the sky. I clutched the only things I'd managed to grab: a thin shawl, my mother's old Bible, and a comb. That was it. That, and my name. Naomi. Somewhere out in the gray distance, coyotes started to howl. A normal woman would have been terrified. But I wasn't. What else could they possibly take from me? The sky was turning the color of old pewter, and the snow was coming down harder, catching on my eyelashes, melting on my lips. My dress, once a cheerful pale yellow, was soaked through, clinging to my legs like a cold second skin. But I kept walking. I didn't know exactly where he lived. The stories were just whispers, rumors passed around the fire. They said he lived past Red Clay Ridge, deep in the canyons where the pines grew so thick they choked out the sun. They called him the Ghost Bear, the shirtless Apache, the man who had pulled a wagon full of children from a flooding river and then vanished before anyone could even thank him. The women in town whispered about the breadth of his shoulders. The men spoke of his silence, and their words were laced with fear. I had nothing left. He was my only chance. By the time I found the trail that bent up toward the canyon, my lips were blue, and my legs were trembling so hard I could barely stand. The snow was up to my knees now, each step a war against the cold. I stumbled once, then twice. The third time, I didn't get back up. My hands sank deep into the drift, and the world started to go dark. "Lord," I whispered, my voice a broken rasp, "just don't let me freeze ugly." It was the last thought I had before the darkness took me completely. A flicker of warmth brought me back. Not heat, but light. The gentle dancing light of a fire. And the world was moving. No, not the world. I was moving. I was being carried. I forced my eyes open and saw a man's bare chest, broad and hard like carved stone, glistening with melted snow. A long black braid swung past my face. My head was resting against his warm skin, and he smelled of pine trees, wood smoke, and something else. Something wild. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my mind. He didn't speak a word. He just kept walking, carrying me as if I weighed nothing at all. He held me like a man holds something precious, not because it's fragile, but because it's important. The cabin was small, just one room, but the air inside was warm and smelled of cedar and smoke. The moment he carried me through the door, the warmth rushed into my cheeks, and the feeling, a painful stinging, returned to my fingers and toes. He knelt down with a grace I'd never seen in a man, and placed me gently on a thick bearskin rug in front of the stone hearth. He took a heavy buffalo hide from a nearby chair and wrapped it around me, swaddling me like a newborn child. Still, he said nothing. I started to shiver. great, racking shudders that shook my whole body as the deep cold began to leave my bones. I looked up at him, my hands trembling. He was kneeling on the other side of the hearth, his face all sharp angles and shadows in the firelight. His eyes were dark, and I couldn't read a single thing in them. He had the stillness of a predator, a man who had long ago decided he didn't owe the world any explanations. I didn't mean to bother you, I rasped, my voice still weak. I didn't know where else to go. The man said nothing. His face wasn't unkind, just quiet, unreadable. I looked down at the heavy hide covering me, then at the fire crackling low and steady between us. I'm Naomi, I offered into the silence. The quiet stretched out long and slow. I thought he would never speak. Then finally his voice came. It was deep and measured, and it cut through the hush like a sharp blade. Talon. Just one word. His name. I nodded, and my mouth trembled. It felt like his name had unlocked something deep inside my chest, a breath I'd been holding for years, a sob that I quickly swallowed back down. I'll leave in the morning, I promised, my voice shaking. I swear it. Talon's dark eyes flicked toward the single window. The snow was practically clawing at the glass now, and the wind howled like a woman in mourning. He stood up, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought he was going to open the door and point me back out into the storm. Instead, he stoked the fire, making the flames leap higher. Then he walked to a rough wooden shelf and took down a clay cup. He filled it with steaming water from a kettle hanging over the fire and handed it to me. I took it with both hands, letting the warmth seep into my frozen fingers. It burned, but it was a good kind of pain. I don't know what folks in town say about me, I whispered, staring into the cup, but I reckon most of it's true. The words just fell out. I hadn't meant to say them. He said nothing. He just sat back down on the hearth, leaving a respectful distance between us. He didn't push, he didn't pry, and his silence, strange as it sounds, steadied me more than any kind words could have. I'm not a bad person, I added, feeling like a little girl explaining a broken doll. I've just been too quiet for too long. Talon stirred. I thought he might finally say something else, but instead he got up, crossed the room to a large wooden trunk, and pulled out a clean, dry shirt. It looked like a man's work shirt, made of soft, worn flannel. He placed it on the bearskin beside me without meeting my eyes. Then he walked to the far side of the small cabin, unrolled a blanket on the floor beside the door, and lay down with his back to me, facing the wall. He had given me the fire. He had given me his bed. I watched the fire dance, its light chasing the shadows from the corners of the room. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, there was only a profound stillness. I curled up beneath the heavy buffalo hide, cradling the warm mug in my hands, and felt my eyelids grow heavy. A man who didn't ask questions, a fire that didn't judge, a silence that didn't punish. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in more years than I could count, I slept without shame. But as I drifted off, a strange thought surfaced. The shirt he gave me. It was too small for a man his size. It was a woman's shirt, and the trunk he'd pulled it from, it had a heavy iron lock on it, a lock he hadn't bothered to fasten. The next morning broke soft and silver. The snow was still falling, but gently now, like a whisper of forgiveness. I woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood, a sharp, clean sound that cut through the quiet. I sat up, pulling the buffalo hide around my shoulders like a cloak, and peered through the small, wavy glass of the window. Talon was outside, shirtless again despite the cold. Steam rose from his skin in the crisp air as he split logs with a smooth, practiced rhythm. His breath came out in slow, white clouds. His face, as always, was a mask. Not cold, just remote, like a distant mountain peak. I opened the cabin door just a crack. The cold air felt good on my face. I'll be gone by noon, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Talon didn't even look up from his work. No rush. Just those two words. but they unraveled something tight and painful in my chest. Not because he was giving me permission to stay, but because he was giving me time. He was giving me a moment to just be. I closed the door slowly and pressed my palms against the rough wood. I didn't know what would happen tomorrow or the day after that. But for today, I wasn't cold, and I wasn't alone. I glanced over at the trunk. The lock was still open, a silent invitation. Or maybe it was a test. I walked over to it, my heart hammering in my chest. I hesitated for only a second before lifting the heavy lid. Inside, it wasn't filled with blankets or tools. It was filled with women's things. A neatly folded calico dress, a pair of small, worn leather shoes, a silver-backed hairbrush, and at the very bottom, a small, leather-bound journal. My hands trembled as I picked it up. This wasn't a guest room. This was a shrine, or a collection. I opened the journal. The handwriting was neat, elegant. It was a woman's diary. I read the first entry, dated 2 years prior. My Talon is a man of few words, but his heart speaks in volumes. The town shuns him, but they do not know the kindness in his hands, the gentleness in his silence. My Talon. This was his wife's journal. The woman who wore the shirt, the dress, the woman who had brushed her hair with the silver brush. I felt a pang of something sharp. Jealousy? No, not that. It was sorrow. A deep, profound sorrow for this woman I'd never met, and for the silent man outside in the snow. I kept reading, my fingers tracing the delicate script. She wrote of their life together in the cabin, of the herbs she grew, of the way he would bring her wildflowers. It was a love story, pure and simple. Until the last entry. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible. The sickness is in my lungs now. The town doctor will not see the wife of an Apache. He called me a squaw and shut the door in my face. Talon forages for me, makes teas, but the fire inside me is going out. He blames himself. I see it in his eyes. He thinks his love was not enough to save me. The entry ended there. The rest of the pages were blank. A tear slid down my cheek and fell onto the page, smudging the ink. He wasn't a monster. He was a widower, a man drowning in a sea of grief, living in a tomb he'd built for his lost love. I closed the journal and placed it carefully back in the trunk. I felt like an intruder, a trespasser on sacred ground, but then I saw it, tucked into a side pocket of the trunk. A small carved wooden bird. It was simple, but beautiful. And beside it, a piece of folded paper. I opened it. It was a drawing, a crude but clear map of the area around the cabin. It showed the creek, the ridge, and a series of strange symbols marking certain locations. And at the bottom, a note in the same shaky handwriting as the last journal entry. If he will not leave this place of ghosts, then someone must lead him out. The truth is buried. Follow the whispers. The truth is buried? What did that mean? And what whispers? Suddenly I heard Talon's footsteps on the porch. I quickly shut the trunk, my heart pounding. He came inside, his arms loaded with freshly split firewood. He didn't look at me, just started stacking the wood by the hearth. The silence between us was different now. It was heavier, filled with the ghost of his wife and the secret of her final cryptic message. She hadn't been resting in peace. She had been leaving him a trail, and now I was the one who had found it. The day passed in a haze of unspoken things. I helped him, or rather, he allowed me to help. I stirred the oatmeal for breakfast, and when my fingers brushed against his as I reached for the honey, a jolt went through me. It wasn't passion, it was connection. A shared, silent understanding of loss. He didn't speak of his wife. He didn't have to. Her presence was in every corner of the cabin, in the way he moved, in the profound sadness that clung to him like his own shadow. I found myself watching him, studying the quiet competence of his hands as he repaired a broken chair, the way he moved with a purpose that seemed almost holy. He was a man who knew how to fix things, but he hadn't been able to fix the one thing that mattered most. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the snow, I knew I couldn't keep the secret. The map felt like a hot coal in my pocket. We were sitting on the porch, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot tea. The air was still and cold. "I know about her," I said softly, not looking at him. "Your wife. I found her journal." Talon went rigid beside me. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like the world had stopped turning. I thought for sure he would be angry, that he would see my discovery as a violation. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Her name was Ilara. She loved you very much," I whispered. He didn't respond. He just stared out at the darkening woods, his jaw tight. "She left something else too," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I pulled the folded map from my pocket and held it out to him. "She left this." He took it from me, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He unfolded it and stared at the crude drawing, his expression unreadable. He traced the symbols with his thumb, his brow furrowed. "The truth is buried. Follow the whispers," I recited from memory. "What does it mean, Talon?" He was quiet for a long, long time. Then he refolded the map, tucked it into his own pocket, and stood up. "It means she was stubborn," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the very first time. It transformed his face, chasing away some of the shadows. "It means she didn't want me to give up." He walked to the edge of the porch and looked up at the first stars beginning to appear in the twilight sky, the whispers. She used to say the wind in the pines sounded like it was whispering secrets. The symbols on the map, they are landmarks, places she loved. He turned to look at me, and his eyes were no longer unreadable. They were filled with a raw, powerful emotion. Not just grief, but something else. Hope. A tiny, fragile flicker of it. "She wanted me to find something," he said. "And I think she wanted me to have someone to help me look." My heart did a strange flip in my chest. He wasn't pushing me away. He was letting me in, not just into his cabin, but into his past, into his pain. The next morning we set out. He saddled his horse, a sturdy, quiet animal, and helped me up behind him. The buffalo hide was wrapped around my shoulders, and the cold air bit at my cheeks. As we rode away from the cabin, I felt a strange sense of purpose. I was no longer a cast-off, a burden. I was a map reader, a secret keeper. The first symbol on the map was a drawing of a split rock. It took us half the day to find it, a massive boulder cleaved in two by some ancient force of nature. We searched the area for hours, digging in the snow, looking for any sign of, well, we didn't know what. Just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, I saw it. A small, flat stone half buried in the snow at the base of the rock. It didn't look natural. I dug it out with my bare hands. There was a single word carved into it. "Listen." Talon knelt beside me, his shoulder brushing against mine. He looked at the stone, then at the map. The next symbol was a drawing of a waterfall. "The creek," he said, his voice low. "There's a small waterfall about a mile down." It was too late to go that day. We returned to the cabin as darkness fell, a new kind of silence between us. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of partners, of two people on a shared quest. That night, as I lay in my bed by the fire, I thought about the word on the stone. Listen. It was what Talon did best. He listened to the woods, to the wind, to the silence. And now, he was listening to the ghost of his wife. The next day we found the waterfall. It was frozen solid, a magnificent sculpture of ice. And there, tucked into a crevice behind the frozen cascade, was another stone. This one had a different word carved into it. Forgive. A lump formed in my throat. This wasn't a treasure map. This was a journey. A path Ilara had laid out for him to walk him back from the edge of his grief. We found 3 more stones over the next 2 days, each in a place special to them, each with a single word: live, love, trust. The last symbol on the map was a drawing of the cabin itself. We returned home, our hearts heavy with the weight of Ilara's final message. She didn't want him to forget her. She wanted him to forgive himself, to live again, to love again, and to trust. But what was the truth that was buried? We had searched the cabin from top to bottom. There was nothing left to find. That night, a storm rolled in, worse than the one that had brought me to his door. The wind shrieked and the snow fell so thick we couldn't see the trees just feet from the window. We were trapped. We sat by the fire, the 5 stones laid out on the hearth between us. Listen, forgive, live, love, trust. It was a poem, a prayer. I don't understand, I said, looking at Talon. What did we miss? What truth is buried here? Talon picked up the stone that said trust. He held it in his palm, his thumb rubbing over the smooth surface. She trusted me, he said, his voice thick. But she also trusted the land. She said the earth holds memories. He stood up and walked to the hearth. He knelt down, his eyes scanning the stones that made up the fireplace. His hands ran over them, feeling each one. Then he stopped. One of the hearthstones was loose. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning understanding. Together we worked our fingers into the crack and lifted. The stone was heavy, but it came free. Underneath, in a small, hollowed-out space, was a small metal box. It was rusted and old. Talon lifted it out with trembling hands. It wasn't locked. He opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not gold or jewels. It was a stack of letters, tied with a ribbon, and beneath them, a deed. A legal document stamped and sealed. Talon picked up the deed. He read it, his face paling. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. He looked at me, his eyes blazing with an emotion I couldn't name. It was shock, disbelief, and fury. "This land," he said, his voice a low growl. "It doesn't belong to me. It never did." He handed me the paper. I read the name on the deed, and the world tilted on its axis. The land, the cabin, everything. It was legally registered to another man, a man from town, my brother Caleb. The name on the deed burned into my brain. Caleb, my own brother, the man who had cast me out into the snow, who had stood by and let his wife call me a burden. It didn't make any sense. "How?" I whispered, looking at Talon. His face was a mask of cold fury, the stillness I had first seen in him now coiled tight, ready to strike. "Your brother works for the land baron, Henderson," Talon said, his voice dangerously low. "Henderson has wanted this land for years. He thinks there's gold in the creek." Suddenly it all clicked into place. The whispers in town, the fear, the hatred directed at Talon. It wasn't just about him being an Apache. It was manufactured, a deliberate campaign to drive him off land that wasn't even his. "But Alara," I started. "She lived here with you. She thought this was your home." Talon picked up the bundle of letters from the box. He untied the ribbon. They were from Caleb, all addressed to Alara. My hands shook as I took one from him. I recognized Caleb's blocky, imprecise handwriting. I read the first few lines, and a wave of nausea washed over me. They weren't love letters. They were threats. Caleb had been blackmailing Alara. He had found out that her father, a man she had fled from, was a wealthy and powerful judge in the East. A judge who had disowned her for marrying an Apache. Caleb threatened to expose her location to her father, to drag her back to a life she had escaped, unless she convinced Talon to leave the land. "She was trying to protect me," Talon said, his voice breaking for the first time. "She was trying to get me to leave, not because she didn't love me, but to save me from your brother, and from what Henderson would do to get this land." The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place. Ilara's sickness, the town doctor refusing to see her. It wasn't just prejudice, it was a command. Henderson, the land baron who owned most of the town, including the doctor, had made sure no one would help her. He had used my brother to terrorize her, and when that didn't work, he had let her die. They had murdered her, slowly, cruelly, and my brother had been his willing instrument. The map, the stones. It wasn't a journey to help Talon grieve. It was a trail of evidence. Alara had known she was dying. She had hidden the proof of Caleb's blackmail and the illegal deed, leaving a trail of clues that only someone who truly knew her and loved her could follow. She was reaching out from the grave, not for peace, but for justice. Rage, cold and pure, washed through me. The hurt I had felt at my brother's betrayal was nothing compared to this. This was a different kind of evil. "He sent me here," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Caleb. He threw me out, knowing I would have nowhere else to go. He sent me here, to you." Talon looked at me, and I saw the realization dawn in his eyes. "He was using you as bait," Talon growled. "He knew Henderson's men would come for me. He thought they'd find you here, that they'd hurt you, and that the town would blame me. It would have been the final excuse Henderson needed to bring the law down on me and take the land for good. My own brother had been willing to sacrifice me, to see me assaulted or worse, just to cover his own tracks and serve his greedy master. The howling of the wind outside seemed to mock us. The storm had us trapped, but the real prison was the truth we had just uncovered. We spent the rest of the night in silence, the box of letters and the false deed sitting on the hearth between us like a coffin. The fire burned low, and the shadows in the cabin grew long and deep. There was nothing left to say. There was only the question of what we would do next. When morning finally came, the storm had passed. The world was covered in a fresh, clean blanket of snow, pristine and perfect, as if trying to hide the ugliness that lay beneath. Talon was already awake. He was standing by the window, not shirtless this time. He was dressed in buckskin pants and a dark wool shirt. Strapped to his back was a bow and a quiver of arrows. In his hand, he held a long, wicked-looking knife. He wasn't the grieving widower anymore. He was the ghost bear. And he was going hunting. "Don't," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I walked to stand beside him. "Talon, don't. This isn't the way. Violence is what they want. It's what they understand. We have to be smarter." He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the trail leading down toward the town. "They killed her, Naomi. They used you. There is no law for men like them. There is only justice. Ilara didn't lead us to this truth so you could get yourself killed," I argued, my hand finding his arm. His muscles were tense, hard as rock. "She left us proof. The letters, the deed. She wanted the truth to come out. Listen, forgive, live, love, trust. Those were her words. Not kill, avenge, die." He finally turned to look at me, his dark eyes searching mine. I saw the war raging inside him, the man who loved and the man who had lost, the gentle soul and the warrior. "What do you suggest we do?" he asked, his voice low. "Walk into town and show these papers to the sheriff who works for Henderson?" "No," I said, a plan beginning to form in my mind, a dangerous, crazy plan. "We don't go to the law. We go to the people. We show them who the real monster is." I told him my idea. He listened, his expression unchanging, his silence a heavy weight in the small cabin. When I was finished, he was quiet for a long time. "It's dangerous," he said finally. "They could turn on you." "They already have," I replied. "I have nothing left to lose, but you do. You could lose this place. You could lose her memory. I won't let that happen." He looked down at my hand on his arm, and then his own hand came up to cover mine. It was the first time he had initiated a touch. It was a promise, an agreement. "All right," he said. "We do it your way." But as we prepared to leave, I saw him slip the long knife into his boot. He was agreeing to my plan, but the warrior was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting, just in case my words weren't enough. The trip to town was different this time. We rode together on Talon's horse, the box containing the letters and the deed wrapped in oilcloth and tucked safely in my lap. I wasn't a refugee seeking shelter anymore. I was a woman on a mission, and the man behind me wasn't a silent mystery. He was my partner. We didn't ride into the center of town. We went to the church. It was Sunday. The whole town would be there. All the people who had judged me, who had whispered about me, who had feared him. and my brother, and Lydia, and the man who pulled all the strings, Mr. Henderson. We tethered the horse behind the church and walked to the front steps, just as the pastor was finishing his sermon. The heavy wooden doors opened, and people began to spill out into the pale morning light, blinking like moles. The chatter died instantly when they saw us. A collective gasp went through the crowd. They stared at me, then at Talon, who stood tall and silent beside me, his presence a challenge. I saw Delia Crocker, the town's chief gossip, her mouth falling open in a perfecto of shock. I saw the blacksmith, the store owner, all the faces that had looked at me with contempt. Then I saw them, Caleb and Lydia. Lydia pulled her daughters close, her face pale with fear. Caleb wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the ground, his face flushed with shame, and finally, a large, well-dressed man with a silver-topped cane stepped forward. He had a neatly trimmed gray beard and cold, calculating eyes. This was Henderson. "Well, well," Henderson said, his voice smooth as oil. "Look what the storm blew in. I believe you're trespassing, boy, and you, Missy, are keeping company that will ruin what's left of your reputation." I took a deep breath and stepped forward, my voice ringing out clear and strong in the sudden silence. My reputation was ruined the day my own brother threw me out of his house and sent me to die in the snow. A murmur went through the crowd. I looked directly at Caleb. "Isn't that right, brother? You sent me up to Talon's cabin. You told me to go there." Caleb paled, stammering. I just thought he could help." "Help?" I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You knew Mr. Henderson's men were planning to pay Talon a visit. You sent me there as bait. You were willing to let them do God knows what to me, just so you could have an excuse to run Talon off his land." The murmurs grew louder. People were looking at Caleb now, at his crumbling facade. "That's a lie!" Henderson boomed, stepping forward. "This woman is a harlot, living in sin with a savage. She's mad." "Am I?" I said, unwrapping the box. "I have proof. Proof of who the real savages are." I opened the box and held up the deed for all to see. This is a deed to the land Talon lives on. A deed made out to my brother, Caleb. A forged deed, created so Mr. Henderson could claim the land was his to take. Then I held up the letters. And these are letters. Letters my brother wrote to Talon's wife, Ilara, threatening her, blackmailing her, tormenting her on her deathbed, all on Mr. Henderson's orders. I started to read from one of the letters, my voice shaking with rage. I read Caleb's cruel words, his threats to drag Ilara back to a life she'd fled. I told them how the town doctor, on Henderson's orders, had refused to treat her, leaving her to die. A woman in the crowd, Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, gasped. "Ilara came to me!" she cried out. "She was so sick. She told me the doctor wouldn't see her. I didn't believe her. I thought she was just making excuses." The tide was turning. The people weren't looking at me with scorn anymore. They were looking at Henderson and Caleb with dawning horror. "Lies! All of it!" Henderson roared, his face turning a blotchy red. He raised his cane to strike me. He never got the chance. Talon moved like a shadow. One moment he was beside me, the next he was in front of me, his hand catching the cane in midair. He wrenched it from Henderson's grasp and snapped it over his knee with a crack that echoed through the stunned silence. "You will not touch her," Talon said, his voice low and deadly. It was more menacing than any shout. Henderson stumbled back, his eyes wide with fear. He looked at the crowd, at the faces that were now turned against him. He saw he had lost. He turned and practically ran, shoving people out of his way. Then all eyes turned to Caleb. He stood alone, exposed. Lydia was staring at him, her face a mask of disbelief and disgust. She finally knew what kind of man she had married. "Caleb," I said, my voice soft now. "Why?" He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with tears. "He had a loan over my head," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The farm. I was going to lose everything. He said if I helped him, he would forgive the debt. I never wanted... Naomi, I'm so sorry. Sorry. The word was empty. Meaningless. I didn't say anything else to him. I just turned my back on him. That was punishment enough. To be seen for what he was by everyone he knew. I looked at Talon. He was watching me, his dark eyes filled with something I had never seen before. Pride. We stood there on the church steps, surrounded by the silent townspeople. The whispers had finally stopped. The truth was out, loud and undeniable. We had won. But as I looked at the faces in the crowd, I saw that the story wasn't over. Henderson was a powerful man. He wouldn't just run away. He would be back. And this time, he wouldn't send my brother to do his dirty work. He would come himself. We didn't stay in town. There were no apologies from the people who had wronged me, no offers of help. There was only a thick, uncomfortable silence. We had shattered their comfortable world of black and white, good and evil, and they didn't know what to do with the messy, gray truth. We rode back to the cabin, the quiet of the woods a welcome relief after the storm of confrontation. Talon was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. The heavy weight of his grief had lifted, replaced by a calm, watchful readiness. The warrior was still there, but he was at peace. When we reached the cabin, he dismounted and then lifted me down from the horse. For a moment his hands lingered on my waist, and our eyes met. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and rough. "You saved her memory. You saved me. We saved each other," I corrected him softly. He nodded, and a small smile touched his lips. He leaned in and kissed my forehead, a gesture so tender and unexpected it made my heart ache. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of gratitude, of partnership. That night, something shifted between us. The invisible wall that had separated us, the ghost of his wife, was gone. We ate dinner in a comfortable silence, our shoulders occasionally brushing as we moved about the small cabin. After we had cleaned up, he took the 5 stones Alara had left for him and placed them on the mantelpiece above the fire. Listen, forgive, live, love, trust. They were a promise, a new foundation for his life, for our life. He turned to me, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes. "Henderson won't let this go," he said. "He'll be back." "I know," I said, "but this time we'll be ready for him." The next few days were a strange kind of calm before the storm. We worked together, reinforcing the cabin door, setting snares in the woods, stockpiling firewood and food. I learned to shoot a bow, my arm surprisingly steady, my aim true. Talon taught me how to read the tracks of animals, how to listen to the language of the forest. He was no longer just teaching me to survive. He was teaching me to fight. In the evenings, we would sit by the fire, and he would tell me stories. Stories of his people, of the ghost bear he was named after, a legendary warrior who was said to be a protector of the innocent. He told me about Alara, about her laughter and her stubborn spirit. He was sharing his past with me, trusting me with his memories. And I told him about my life, about the years of being invisible, of silencing my own needs to serve others. I told him about the secret I'd kept for Lydia, about how her first child hadn't been Caleb's, a truth I had buried to keep the peace in their home. He listened, his silence a comforting embrace. He didn't judge, he just understood. One night as we sat on the porch watching the stars, he took my hand. His fingers laced with mine, a perfect fit. "Naomi," he said, his voice serious, "when this is over I want to build a new life here, with you." My breath caught in my throat. "Talon." "I'm not asking you to replace her," he said quickly. "I'm asking you to stand beside me, to be my partner, my wife." Tears welled in my eyes, not tears of sadness, but of a joy so profound it was painful. "I don't need a ring," I whispered. "I just need you." He leaned in and kissed me then, a real kiss, full of all the unspoken words that had passed between us. It was a kiss of promises made and futures to be built. It was the kiss of a man who had finally learned to live again. Our peace was shattered 3 days later. It was just after dawn. One of Talon's snares, a warning system of bells he had set up at the edge of the woods, went off. We grabbed our weapons, Talon his bow and quiver, me a rifle he had taught me to use. We crouched by the window, peering out into the morning mist. They came on horseback, 10 of them, led by Henderson himself. They were armed to the teeth, their faces grim and determined. This wasn't a warning. This was an army. "They're going to burn us out," Talon said, his voice low. "Let them try," I replied, my hand steady on the rifle. I was no longer the frightened woman who had stumbled through the snow. I was a protector. This was my home. He was my family. The first shot rang out, splintering the wood of the cabin wall just inches from my head. The siege had begun. For hours, we held them off. Talon was a ghost, moving from window to window, his arrows finding their marks with deadly accuracy. I fired the rifle sparingly, making every shot count. We were outnumbered, but we had the advantage of the terrain, of the cabin's strong walls. But they were relentless. They used a log as a battering ram, slamming it against the door over and over again. The wood began to crack and splinter. It was only a matter of time. Just as the door was about to give way, we heard it. A shout from the woods behind the cabin, then another, and another. Through the back window, I saw them. A group of men, appearing from the trees like spirits. At first, I thought they were more of Henderson's men, that we were surrounded. But then I saw the man in the lead. It was the blacksmith from town, and beside him was the store owner, and the baker. They were armed with hunting rifles, with pitchforks, with axes. The townspeople. They had come. They had seen Henderson's army ride out, and they had made a choice. They had chosen to stand with us. The tide of the battle turned in an instant. Henderson's men, caught between the cabin and the surprise attack from the rear, panicked. The fight was short and brutal. When the dust settled, Henderson was captured, his men subdued. The townspeople stood victorious, breathing heavily, looking at us with a newfound respect. The blacksmith walked up to the porch, his face smudged with dirt. "We were wrong about you," he said to Talon. "Both of you." Talon simply nodded, his face unreadable as always, but I could see the gratitude in his eyes. Just then, 2 figures emerged from the crowd. It was Caleb and Lydia. Lydia was holding a basket of food. Caleb was carrying a bundle of blankets. They stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, their faces filled with a shame that was deeper than any I had ever seen. We came to help," Lydia said, her voice barely a whisper. "We know it's not enough. We know we can never make up for what we did. But we had to try." I looked at my brother, at the man who had betrayed me in the worst way possible. I saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, and I thought of Alara's stones. Forgive. It wouldn't be easy. It might not even be possible. But it was a start. "Leave the basket on the porch," I said, my voice soft. They did, and then they turned and walked away, back to the town they had to live in, with the truth of who they were now laid bare for all to see. The story of the ghost bear and the outcast woman became a legend in that small town. They talked of the day the town stood up to a tyrant, the day they chose justice over fear. Henderson was sent away, his land and power broken. Caleb and Lydia slowly began to rebuild their lives, their shame a constant companion. And up in the cabin, past Red Clay Ridge, a new life began. A life built not on sorrow and secrets, but on trust and truth. Talon and I were married by the creek, with the whispering pines as our witnesses and Alara's 5 stones as our vows. We found our peace. We found our home. We found each other. Sometimes the greatest storms don't come to destroy you. They come to clear the path for a future you never thought possible. They come to show you who you really are, and who you are meant to stand beside. And if you're brave enough to face the wind, you might just find that the person you were always meant to be was waiting on the other side. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Let us know in the comments below, what does it truly mean to forgive?